On November 10th, iBlink22, a Breath of Fire speedrunner, would get on the run of his life. His current record was close to being under 5 hours, a time that had never been achieved, and this run had the potential to smash that barrier. For the first 45 minutes of the run, Blink was in the red, but by the end of that hour, he would get almost a minute and a half in the green, and he'd keep that pace until it was whittled away back into the red by the start of the second hour. His streak of bad luck didn't last forever, and by the time he was at the final boss, he was exactly a minute and a half ahead. If he doesn't lose time on this split, he'd pull off the first ever sub 5 hour time. Unfortunately for Blink, he'd come up 6 seconds short, but given all the time he lost in the run, it was clear that a sub 5 hour time was going to happen. And the community braced for what they thought would be a momentous occasion, as Blink was sure to lower the record. However, instead of a sub 5 hour run, they were surprised by something else. On November 16th, Blink was streaming sub 5 attempts, and this run, like his previous record, was having massive time swings, only getting ahead after the halfway point. But before he could celebrate his pace and try to take it to a new record, a runner named Brood posted in his chat. Without outright saying that Blink is splicing, Brood asks what he would do if proof called. Taken aback by these accusations, Blink offers reasons for why his run is legit and even offers to hard reset at the end to prove it's real, which he does. Before leaving chat, Brood says that he does have proof that Blink is cheating and will be posting it the following day. And on November 17th, he uploaded 2 videos where he explains why he got suspicious of Blink's run, then goes into a full audio analysis where he alleges that splicing has occurred. But before we get into the allegations, we need to talk about this video's sponsor, ExpressVPN. Imagine you go to my YouTube channel and are told you can only watch certain videos because of your country of residence. That would be terrible, and I'd never do this to you, but streaming services do, as they have thousands of shows available, but region lock lots of content, like the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie. However, with ExpressVPN, this problem is easily fixed, as all you need to do is change your country and the region-locked content becomes available. Personally, I love ExpressVPN for its privacy tools, as ISPs in the United States can track your browsing history and legally sell that data to companies without your consent. With ExpressVPN, however, ISPs can't see your online activity, safely anonymizing your data behind their secure server, with it also being encrypted. And the best part is, it only takes a single button press to do this, with the app working on phones, laptops, and even routers. So protect your data now and get ExpressVPN. Find out how you can get 3 months free by scanning the QR code on screen, clicking the link in the description box below, or by going to expressvpn.com/Abyssoft. And with that, let's get back to the allegations. The first thing that made Brood suspicious was the luck that he thought Blink was getting with a segment in the early game, the night split. How your previous level ups and battles go leading into this boss can impact if you get a good fight for the night, and Brood thought Blink's luck was better than normal at getting through this split. Once he thought Blink's night split was odd, he started noticing other things that didn't seem right. In particular, there's a section where Blink appears to react to something before it actually happens. In the clip, you can hear him utter something like, "Oh my god," before he falls down a pit, then reacts with a louder reaction.
Oh my god. No, I did it again!
Brood acknowledges that this isn't great evidence of anything below board happening, but with these bizarre occurrences, he decided to dig deeper. He needed a way to prove what he suspected, and he didn't want to make an accusation without solid evidence. So he reached out to a mod on several RPG games who told him that audio analysis is considered to be the gold standard when it comes to detecting splices. After watching a video the mod sent him, he explains that he taught himself how to perform audio analysis, specifically spectral and mains hum analysis. If you're unfamiliar, a spectrogram is a visual representation of frequencies as they vary over time, and is a common method of detection for identifying spliced runs, but mains hum is a bit different, however. Whenever you plug a device into a power outlet, you're connecting it to an electrical grid that has a specific frequency caused by the alternating current that the grid is supplying. Sometimes you can hear this frequency, since it's just a vibration caused by the electricity, but oftentimes it's too low for humans to hear. However, that doesn't mean the device isn't producing a mains hum. If you make an audio recording of a device such as a game console, you'd see at the lower end of the frequencies that there's a constant tick around 50 or 60 Hz depending on your geographical location, and this tick is the mains hum. In the case of a game console, as long as you don't reset or power off, the mains hum will be present and uninterrupted in any recording you make of it. But if someone splices video footage that contains audio audio, you'll see a hiccup or change in the repetition of the mains hum instead of a constant tick. For Brood's analysis, he begins by scrubbing through the spectral view of the video to find areas that are suspicious, and he finds one when Blink enters a town called Romero, so he performs a deeper spectral analysis. To do this, he amplifies the audio, then sets up a parametric filter, which allows you to isolate specific frequencies and ignore others. After doing this, he scrubs over the transition very slowly, so that you can only hear the music briefly as he moves the playhead forward, and makes note of a clicking on the audio track. He goes over the same split from another runner, and the same pops and clicks are present in the audio, but in this case, Brood says these are likely from audio clipping, which is when sound goes beyond its maximum volume from amplification, and not a splice. He notes that the clicking in Blink's run isn't normal, and to prove his point, he switches to analyzing the mains hum. He then applies 2 filters to the audio to get a better view at the frequencies he wants to look at, and we'll talk about these in more depth later. The first clip he looks at is from another runner, as he wants to show what a mains hum looks like during a transition on a run he doesn't believe is cheated. And as you see from the video, the mains hum remains consistent throughout the entire transition. He then looks at the mains hum in Blink's run at the same segment, showing that before the transition, the hum is consistent, but he makes note that it contains some noise because of the high amplitude he's applied to it. During the transition, however, he points out that some noise enters the spectral view, with the ticks becoming hard to track and the gap between them getting larger, concluding that a splice has occurred, which results in the change in tick. He then switches to analyzing the opening of the run when Blink resets the console, and once again, he observes clicks and pops when listening to the playhead being moved ahead slowly, so he switches to analyzing the mains hum. The interesting part about this is that during the initial reset, Brood observes a massive burst of energy on the spectrogram, which he attributes to a double signal, and Blink talking during the transition to try and hide the splice. Looking at the hum ticks before the transition, he notes that they're uniform, but during the transition, everything delineates with the tick becoming distorted. He then removes all of the filters he's applied to the clip and lets it play unaltered. His conclusion is that there's nothing going on in the recording that explains why these discrepancies are being observed. For the rest of Brood's video, he goes over other instances where he scrubs through audio to demonstrate splices, but for the sake of this video, we'll only be focusing on the Romero split and the initial reset before the run started. To summarize, Brood's allegation was that Blink was playing over pre-recorded footage he spliced together and that the run wasn't legit. And not long after he posted his video to the Discord, a streamer named Zeal would watch it live on stream, with Brood and Blink both being present in his chat. The first thing Zeal notes is that when it comes to Blink's night segment, it wouldn't make sense for him to splice the same fight over and over, as that would make it easy to get caught. So he deduces that if Blink is splicing, he must have created a ton of good night splits. When it comes to the fake acting, Zeal isn't convinced that there's enough evidence to conclude Blink is reacting to something before it happens, so he gets into the spectral and mains hum analysis. Brood's analysis of the change in mains hum doesn't convince Zeal, so he asks if all of Blink's inventory and character stats were consistent throughout the run, with Brood replying that everything in that regard checked out, which meant if Blink is cheating, he went through every possible discrepancy and made sure they were consistent throughout the run. After thinking this through, Zeal realizes that because there is randomness in character stats at level up, that to splice a run like this, Blink was either editing the save file between segments to keep them consistent, perhaps by running on a flash cart, or he was running on an emulator so that after each split, he could redo the next section as many times as he needs so that the stats were consistent. Zeal then goes through the logic of Brood's accusation and says this.
So what I don't understand is, you say he gets constantly very lucky nights and like good early games, but these early games don't always are PBs and world records, right? So like, why would he get lucky nights and a good early game that dies later somewhere? Like he basically splices dead runs too, or like what's the point there?
This is an interesting line of thought because Blink would routinely get a run with good nights that would die later in the game, with Zeal stating that it would be easier to do runs than to splice together a bunch of dead runs. In response to this, Brood says that he only looked at Blink's 5-hour record and his 501, and didn't look at any runs on days he didn't get one going. Zeal then looks at the part of the video where Brood goes over the reset leading into the world record run, and he has questions.
But why is it like so crazy big here, but not on the other splice? Like, what's the big difference?
Getting deeper into the allegation video, Zeal says he'd like to see a reset from a legit run so he can compare it to Blink's reset.
It's like you're basically telling me this is a cheat, but you don't tell me how it looks uncheated. I cannot see it myself. I basically have to trust that you know what you're talking about.
A chatter named Elliot also says that he'd like to see what videos Brood used to teach himself to do audio analysis. Brood doesn't answer in the chat, but it was something I was curious about as well, and we'll get into it later. It wasn't until Zeal started comparing the stats of party members between splits that Blink showed up in the stream, and says that he doesn't run on a flash cart and runs on an actual SNES with a real game cartridge. And when asked by another chatter how he's splicing on a real cartridge, he replies that he can't and that the audio distortions could be from any number of issues with his stream setup. Eventually, Zeal watches the VOD where Brood confronts Blink live on stream, and notes that it's funny Brood asked him to do a menu during a cutscene. However, after the cutscene where he has the freedom to do so, Blink never opens a menu. Zeal concluded that without a legit run being reset to make a comparison to, that there isn't definitive proof, and that when it comes to the mains hum, the distortion and noise observed needs to be explained in a way to show that it can only happen when it's spliced. At this point, I stated in Zeal's chat that I'd be performing an investigation to get to the bottom of these allegations. So let's restate the evidence and claims that Brood made. First is that he initially got suspicious because he thought Blink was getting too good of RNG on his early game. Second is that he thought Blink was faking reactions to things before they happened. And third is that due to his analysis of the audio, that Blink was splicing his run together and pretending to play over it. For the purposes of the investigation, I decided not to focus on the first two claims since they are incidental to the main claim that Blink is splicing. If the evidence showed that Blink was splicing, those allegations don't need to be confirmed, and if the evidence showed that he wasn't splicing, then another hypothesis would need to be presented for how he was cheating. So, I got started by analyzing the audio from Blink's run, except there's one problem. I'm not an audio engineer or audio analyst. For this reason, I reached out to dwangoAC, someone who worked on the Diablo 1 investigation and who has experience looking at audio and video discrepancies. The first thing we did was have Blink describe his streaming setup and then have him perform some audio and visual tests so we could get a baseline of what audio and video looked like on his console. Once his setup was established, it was verified that he was indeed running on a real cartridge, but that he does own a flash card. So Dwango had him load a file onto it that would test some different things on his console by analyzing the output of his CPU and APU clock speeds. Because the CPU is manufactured using a quartz crystal that runs at a consistent 21 MHz and the APU runs at 24.576 MHz, the clocks on these two parts are different by default. And since the APU is created using a ceramic oscillator, its clock speed will change over time due to decay from age and the ambient temperature. What this means is that if you take readings at different times, the output will be different due to slight variations in the clock speed. Whereas if you run this test on an emulator, the results will be constant since an emulator doesn't have hardware that degrades over time. When Blink ran this test, his values were different, so we were able to confirm that he was indeed running on a real console. And given the unique video output of his setup, we also confirmed that the video feed from before and after the alleged splices was taking place on the same setup. Dwango then had Blink perform 3 audio tests, one where he records the console while it wasn't playing audio and his mic was muted to get a baseline of the console's hum, another where he unmuted the mic and took another recording, and then a final test where both pieces of hardware were unmuted. Upon looking at the test with the mic unmuted, Dwango realized something. The audio result was the same as when the mic was muted, meaning that something was interfering with the test. It was at this point that Blink informed us he uses a gate on his mic set at -28 decibels, so there won't be a hum from the mic visible on a spectrogram or on his streamed audio if the mic isn't picking up sound due to the gate being active. To get the hum of Blink's mic without a gate, it was disabled and recorded again. And to finish off the tests, we had Blink record a reset and a power off, not just so that we could compare it to the alleged splice, but so we could see how long it took the different parts of his setup to notice that the signal had been dropped, as the RetroTink and capture card both add lag to the device chain. After these tests, we were able to conclude the following: that Blink's console was behaving exactly as it should given its age, that his mic was showing specific spikes and characteristics at particular frequencies, and that when the gate was activated, those frequencies weren't visible. On top top of this, we were able to conclude that his power cycle does have delay due to the chain of devices it needs to go through. And since we identified the audio artifacts present in his baseline recordings, we can then compare them to the alleged splices found by Brood. This left us with the comparison itself, and while we did reach a conclusion on if Blink had spliced, we aren't audio engineers and wanted a second opinion. So without telling anyone our conclusion, we passed the baseline recordings we gathered to 2 audio engineers and an IT specialist, who then performed their own analysis on those recordings and the alleged splices in Blink's run. The trio consisted of JRP, a Metroid series speedrunner and audio engineer, CompuCat, an audio engineer, and Balthazar, an IT professional with a specialty in video and audio. And they were all kind enough to create independent reports that go over everything. I'll link these below so you can read them for yourselves, but for now, let's start with JRP's report, and the first thing he looks at are the baseline clips we had Blink create. His analysis of the baseline clips showed that the microphone has a high gain setting as it was picking up sound reflection from the wall. But not only this, due to the gain setting being so high, he was able to isolate a frequency that would match a 60Hz CRT television, adding more weight to the claim that Blink's setup was legit. When JRP looked at the baseline footage for power cycling the console, he noticed one thing in particular: audio pops just like Brood saw at the start of the run he alleges was spliced. Except JRP has an alternative explanation for these pops. When you power on a preamp, which is something that amplifies a signal, a common occurrence is a surge of electrical power that will be outputted as a popping sound. This means that the power surge and popping sounds Brood observed at the start of the run are completely normal, as confirmed by the baseline test. JRP also identifies the mains hum, and his conclusion is that it's impossible to determine which piece of equipment is emitting it. However, as previously mentioned, due to the frequency present, it may be coming from a CRT, but what is definitive is that it's coming from hardware plugged into a wall outlet. When it comes to the Super Nintendo itself, he observes a loud buzzing that gets louder when the console is outputting audio and video. This is explained by aging and decaying hardware, as the Super Nintendo suffers from internal issues that cause crosstalk between the video and audio signals. So how is this relevant to the allegations if it's just console noise? If we look at the spectrogram, we see that the 60Hz tick of the hum is present, but at certain times it gets hard to see and even disappears when sound is being played. JRP offers that it's likely disappearing due to audio from the console being played, but notes that the harmonic that occurs at 120 Hz is still present, indicating that the mains hum is still being produced. So rather than this being evidence for splicing, it's more likely that the gaps in the 60Hz mains hum are being caused by audio from the console. With all of this evidence, JRP concludes that this is a real console setup, but one thing he does note is that the noise gate applied to the mic will cause the mains hum of the CRT to cut in and out, resulting in something similar to compression artifacts, which brings us to his analysis of the run itself. Taking a recording from a random section of the run, JRP looks to see if its audio matches the bass recordings, and there are gaps in the 60Hz mains hum just like the test audio has, with the 120Hz harmonic being present most of the time. So far, so good. On the reset that starts the run, he observes that the mains hum is present and that there is a blip with buzzing in the audio. But all of this is normal. Importantly, the waveform doesn't have any readily visible gaps or anything of note when the game is silent. And while the mains hum does have gaps at 60 Hz, this is consistent with other games on the SNES. Moving ahead to the loading transition when Blink enters Romero, JRP notes that there's an audible sound in the recording, but it's likely a key being pressed as Blink has a split that ends at the same time. Throughout the run, he notices small sounds that occur in 3 different places, such as this one.
Living the dream, crunching the numbers.
Despite isolating them, he can't precisely identify what they are, but he is able to determine what's likely causing them. If you have a microphone with a noise gate applied to it and the gain turned up, sometimes the beginning of sounds will get cut off and only small portions of them will be captured. This can result in artifacts appearing on the waveform and being audible, but crucially, these likely aren't from a splice as the mains hum from the CRT gets louder when these sounds are present, indicating that these noises are likely coming from audio the mic's picking up once the gate has been surpassed. If we look at Balthazar's report, he focuses on the mains hum during the screen transition at Romero as well, and during the transition, he notices that there is a decrease in the signal from the hum. But since the video feed completely fades to black, this is explained by the crosstalk between the video and audio feeds mentioned earlier, as a weaker video signal won't add as much interference to the audio, resulting in a weaker mains hum signal. Like the other reports, he also shows that the harmonics of the mains hum are consistently present despite the hum signal weakening at 60 Hz, which is due to the video feed interference weakening when it fades to black as explained a moment ago. When it comes to conclusions, all of the reports are in agreement. Blink is running on a real console, the power cycle is consistent with an SNES, the degradation of the signal during a screen transition is expected due to the video feed interference weakening as the feed fades to black, and there isn't any evidence that the run was spliced. This was the same conclusion that myself and Dwango reached in our initial analysis, but the story doesn't end here, however, as this left a few questions for me and the team unanswered. Mainly, how did Brood come to the conclusion that there was evidence of splicing? When I asked the experts to evaluate Brood's video, they told me two things. The filters he applied weren't set up great, and the way he scrubbed audio wasn't how it's normally done. We'll get to the filters in a bit, so for now, let's focus on how he scrubbed the audio. Looking at Brood's video, he scrubbed the audio frame by frame, which isn't how this is normally done, as you aren't getting the full sound. So you might be hearing something partway through the waveform or parts of different sounds being played together, which results in it being heard as a pop or click, when in reality, it's just a partial sound. Instead, a more proper form of analysis is to play back small samples and look for discrepancies, rather than go bit by bit. Brood may not have been aware of these issues when he performed his analysis, which had me wondering how he learned to examine audio. If we look back at his initial video, he says that a mod told him audio was a good way to find splices and that they sent him a video. Being curious, I asked Brood what the video was, as I wanted to see if maybe it had some bad information. Instead of a video going over audio tools, he sent me a link to this video by Apollo Legend where he goes over various cheaters in speedrunning. And Brood said after watching a section of this video, he decided to learn how to do audio analysis so he could look at Blink's run. So he consulted ChatGPT. Now, I know what you're all thinking. How in the heck could someone trust ChatGPT to perform something this nuanced and complicated? And I'm going to show you how, because Brood sent me over 100 pages of his log with ChatGPT, and we'll see exactly what his process was and where it went wrong. Before we get into the chat logs, I need to say that there aren't any timestamps, so it's difficult to make a timeline of what instructions ChatGPT was giving Brood and when. But according to him, he sometimes ignores what it told him and made alterations to its instructions because he had multiple chats open with it, so with that knowledge, let's proceed. In one of his logs, Brood gives ChatGPT a screenshot of some audio during a transition and asks what it thinks about it. ChatGPT then gives him reasons for why the audio in the picture could be spliced and concludes that the audio is suspicious. But there's one problem. Brood gave it audio that he didn't think was spliced, so ChatGPT gave a false positive. ChatGPT then gives Brood reasons for why it could have been a false positive, including some that we went over earlier in this video, such as how the system handles audio transitions and artifacts introduced due to the capture setup. To Brood's credit, he did say that in the chat logs he didn't send me that ChatGPT was giving him bad responses and that he realized he couldn't rely on it for detecting splices from images. So, I asked him why he had confidence that it would be useful to learn audio analysis from, given that it was providing bad responses when he was getting it to analyze images. He replied that ChatGPT was misunderstanding his question and said that it wasn't useful for analysis, but it seemed useful for helping him tune the software. So let's see how it did in that regard. In one of the logs, Brood asks ChatGPT the best way to give it these without distorting the information while making it more visible. Based on ChatGPT's reply, it seems like he's referring to audio samples, specifically ones with artifacts and splices. And while it does tell him in this instance to only use moderate amplification, it doesn't explicitly warn him about over-amplification. Instead, it only tells him that a 30 decibel increase might cause some grain and blockiness. Unfortunately, ChatGPT concludes this question by saying that the methods it has laid out will maintain the audio's integrity while minimizing the risk of false positives. Throughout this same log, the chatbot tells him multiple times to use smaller amplification amplifications than 30 decibels, except in the case where GPT was explaining a splice artifact line and Brood asked it if Audition had a feature to scan for them. In this case, it told him to do a 30 decibel amplification even if it creates a distortion. So within the same log, the chatbot is going against its previously stated guidelines. Contrast this with the audio experts who explicitly called out from the beginning that overuse of amplification isn't a good approach for this type of audio analysis. And if we look at the settings Brood applies, we'll see that he uses a lot of amplification. When looking at the spectral view, he applies an amplification of 30 decibels. This isn't something he should be doing according to the experts, as it can introduce artifacts that normally wouldn't be there. But if we look at the filters he sets up when looking at the mains hum, the amplification gets turned up even higher. The first filter he sets up is a parametric EQ filter that boosts the mains hum and its frequencies by 30 decibels. He then applies a notch filter where he's checked the fixed gain 2 setting, which applies another 30 decibels to the mains hum and its harmonics for a total boost of 60 decibels. If we look at some of Brood's ChatGPT logs, we see he asks how to detect the mains hum, and this is where it first tells him about a notch filter. It says that it can be used to remove the frequency of the mains hum, but Brood corrects the chatbot and says he wants to use it to detect a speedrun cheater, not get rid of it. During the messages, we see it tell him that the fixed gain 2 setting he set at 30 decibels is helpful for detecting the mains hum, but that it may need to be reduced. After Brood says he's not seeing much visual feedback, ChatGPT then tells him to increase the gain even more. When I asked the experts about these filters, they said that the way he set them up boosted the signal. However, a notch filter normally isn't used to do pure amplification, and one of the experts breaks down how they used it in their analysis. In Balthazar's report, he outlines how he applied a specialized notch filter that affects the mains hum, but he set it up as a band pass filter, which lets him output only the mains hum itself. According to Balthazar, had Brood been aware of this, he could have corrected the settings on his notch filter, which would have given him a cleaner picture. During the investigation, the conclusion the experts reached was unfortunately leaked to Brood before the reports were ready to be released. This is something we tried to avoid as we didn't want to bias anyone during the investigation. However, despite knowing our conclusion, Brood still believed that the run was cheated. Brood had spent more time learning how to do audio analysis, and in a DM to me, he acknowledges that in his video, his findings weren't presented the best, and that he used way too much amplification. He goes on to explain how he should have presented the evidence, and now that the reports are public, it will be interesting to see if he changes his mind once he's read them. Overall, this situation could have been handled much better, as Brood didn't need to go into Blink's stream and accuse him while he was live, nor did he need to post his evidence in the Discord for the public to see. In fact, after speaking with Gin, the head mod for Breath of Fire, he told me that he explicitly told Brood not to make this public until he did. Brood did acknowledge that this was a terrible way to handle things and that he regrets making it public, but I can only imagine how Blink felt during this entire process, as not only were these allegations made public, but he had to watch the entire community speculate on them. Even though he knew he was innocent, this couldn't have been an easy ordeal to go through, and I'd like to offer my thanks to him for cooperating during the investigation and providing us with valuable recordings of his setup. And given that he was close to a sub 5-hour time, Blink streamed attempts after the allegations with increased proof standards such as a hand cam, and not long after, he shattered the sub 5 barrier. This has been one of the more unique cheating scandals I've ever seen, and I can't wait to bring you more content, so subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode of Abyssoft Z.